Hey everyone, it's Jeremy Signer, and today we're going to make this woven basket texture in Substance Designer. I put out a quick tweet asking if anyone was interested in a texture like this, and it turns out there are. Whether you're just getting started in Substance Designer or you're looking for a fun way to scramble some nodes together, this tutorial is a great exercise to create something simple but very effective. By the way, if you'd like to follow along with a fully completed graph, you can find a link in the description down below to my Gumroad page. Alright, let's take a look at what we're going to be creating. Okay, so I loaded up a quick scene in Marmoset, and here is the material that we're going to be making today, this woven basket. You can see we have a lot of really cool details here. We've got some cracks, we've got some chipping, a couple pits, and this really nice detail where these horizontal bands and these vertical columns sort of meet up. We've got this nice detail here, and a nice color, and some good variation in wood grain. And if I just move the light around here, you can see a little bit of the roughness and how it reacts to the light there. It's going to be really fun, and we can make a really nice material today. Okay, so we're in Substance Designer. You can see I have the finished graph here. Let's start off by creating a new one. So we're going to File, New Substance. Going to choose the PBR Metallic Roughness template. Let's give this a name. I'm going to call this Woven Basket, and I'm going to put Tutorial here. Size mode, I'm going to change the size mode to relative to parent, and I'm going to do the width and height at 4K and 16 bits per channel. I'm going to hit OK. So the reason why we chose relative to parent is if we go to this parent size option here and we click that, you can change the graph's size from here, and it's going to adjust relative to what you put. So you could choose 2K, and we can preview this at 2K. I'm going to change this back to 4K, but that's just a quick way to change the graph size. So first up, let's just make sure that we're all looking at the same thing. So I'm using a rounded cylinder here. So to choose this particular piece of geometry, go to Scene in your 3D view and then choose Rounded Cylinder. Next up, I'm going to create this final blend node that I use in all of my tutorials and all of my graphs. And what this does is allows me to quickly see what I'm doing in my graph height-wise and have it automatically route to my normal ambient occlusion and height outputs, and I can see everything that's going on in my 3D view. So what I'm going to do is hit spacebar and create a blend node, blend, and I'm going to connect this output to the normal conversion node here, and also going to get rid of these two uniform colors. These are connected to the ambient occlusion outputs and the height outputs. So let's just select those and delete that, and let's connect this blend to the height. And then we can't connect this blend directly into ambient occlusion just yet. We need to create, hit spacebar, type in ambient. We got this ambient occlusion HBAO node. And this will take our height information and generate that ambient occlusion information for us. So we just connect the blend to that HBAO ambient occlusion node and then connect that output to our ambient occlusion output. Now, we've got some weird red lines and things going on here. That's because a blend node can take both color and grayscale information, and right now it doesn't know which one we're using. But as soon as we put some grayscale height information into the foreground of this final blend node, it's going to correct everything for us and stop yelling at us with these dotted red lines. So just going to save my graph here, and let's start building our height. So we're going to start with the larger shapes first, and then focus in on the details. So let me pull up the reference that I'm looking at for this particular material. We're going to start by creating these horizontal woven pieces of wood here. So notice in a reference how the horizontal bands come out to a point and then come back in again. You can see that over here, out to a point and then back in again. Now we can replicate this with a gradient linear 3 node, which has a sharper transition in values than a gradient linear 2 version. So let me show you what that means. I'm just going to bring this over here for now. If I hit spacebar and I type in gradient, you can see we have linear 1, 2, and 3. Here's linear 3, and here is gradient linear 2. You can see how gradient linear 3 has this sharper point where the values come to this right in the middle and then come back down again, whereas linear 2 is much more smooth. So because we want our bands to come to a point, let's use gradient linear 3. So what I need to do now is double-click gradient linear 3, go to the rotation parameter, and choose 90. So now we're going from left to right or horizontally. And because the gradient linear 3 node is so sharp, let's blur it a little bit to make a more natural bend. So I'm going to click on our gradient linear 3, hit spacebar, and bring in a blur, high quality grayscale. And so we can play with this intensity here, and you can kind of see in that 2D view right up here how this line is starting to fade a little bit and become much more soft. Now you can adjust this intensity a little bit later on if you'd like the bands to be more pointy and sharp. But for now, let's make it a little more smooth, something like 4.87. Now, next up, I need to supply a round horizontal cable or cylinder shape to multiply onto our pointy gradient to define where this band is horizontally. And that's going to make more sense here in a second. So what I'll do is I'll now bring in our gradient linear 2. This looks more like a cable or more like a cylinder. And so to emphasize that even more, after our gradient linear 2, I'm going to bring in a curve node. Now, curve nodes are a great way to sculpt these gradients into a more complex shape. And you can check out more on how we do that with my functions and parameters video. Now, I'll put a link up in the top right here or down in the description below, and you can check out that really cool video. We make this picture frame utility node. Lots of fun. So in this case, we're going to enhance this tube that we're making by brightening the midtones and keeping a nice round fall off. And so this is just going to tighten the edges so that it looks more like that cable or tube that we're going for. So let's go over to our properties here, and this is our curve editor. What I'm going to do is I'm going to double click right in the middle, and then I'm going to take these handles here, just moving one, and just stretch them out like this. This rounds off the changes we're about to make with this point. So if I bring this point further up to the top left, notice here in our 2D view, as I do that, the edges get a little bit tighter. We start creating a more sharp definition to the top and bottom. So that's what our curve is looking like. Now let's multiply these two shapes together. So I'm going to click on my graph, hit spacebar, bring in a blend, and now I'm going to take my blur, high quality grayscale into the foreground, and then take my curve and put it in the background. Let's change this blending mode to multiply. And so you can see now quickly in the 2D view, if I just switch between this blur high quality grayscale and now this blend, the tops and bottoms here are now showing off that tube that we've made. And so now I have the base shape for these horizontal bands that we're going to make. Now with this band shape that we've created, we can define two versions of it that are going to interlink with one another and look like they're weaving. And we can do that with two tile sampler nodes. All right, so let's make some room. I'm just going to grab everything we've made so far and just move it to the left here. So let's bring in a tile sampler node. So spacebar, tile sampler, and I'm going to connect this blend here into the pattern 1 input of the tile sampler right at the top. Now, what I want to do is I want to change the pattern to reference this pattern 1 input. So I'm going to go to pattern, pattern input. You can see a little bit what's going on here in our 2D view. Let's change how many times we're multiplying this pattern around. So I'm going to change the X amount to 2. So we have 2 columns here. Then I'm going to decrease the Y amount to something like 7. Then I'm going to scroll down a little bit and go to the size parameters of our tile sampler. And let's adjust the size a little bit. So you can see under size here, we have these sliders and they go down. You can see we're decreasing the size on the X and Y, but what if we want to increase and stretch these out? Well, we can type a larger number into these parameters here. So for instance, I can type in 2 and it now stretches these bands out. So I can adjust how wide I want them to be, and I just want them to overlap just a little bit. So 1.47 on the X. And then I want to squish them down vertically. So let's bring this down to something like, let's do 0.81. And so now let's see what we're creating by plugging this tile sampler into the foreground of our final blend. You can see our connections now have grayed out and they look good. And we can get an idea kind of what's going on, but now we need to set up our shader here so we can start seeing some displacement and tessellation. So go to your 3D view, go to Materials, Default, Physically Metallic Roughness, and choose Tessellation. On the right now, I'm going to go to the tessellation factor and just drag this all the way up to 16 and just bring up the scale. And so now in our 3D view, we can start to see some displacement, some real height happening to our cylinder. You get an idea of what this texture is going to do when we apply some displacement in our 3D application of choice. But I want to add a little bit more definition, and that comes here from this normal conversion node. So I'm going to double click the normal node, and I'm going to change this intensity, and I'm going to bring it up really high. Something like, let's go with 10. And now you can really start to see we've got that point here, which we were looking for. We've got some specular highlights and some definition here where our bands start to begin. And let's adjust our ambient occlusion a little bit too. So I'm going to go to ambient occlusion. We can change this height depth and add some more shadows. Don't think I want to do it too much. 0.14 looks nice. And so this sets up everything in our shader so we can start to see what's really happening with our material. So we've got these large bands, but now I need to make some small bands that are in the middle here. And that's going to give us this weaving pattern by having two different offset columns of bands. So what we should do next is take this tile sampler and duplicate it. Control D or Control C, Control V, just duplicate the tile sampler, double click on it here so we can see what we're doing. And now let's change a couple of these parameters. And the first thing I want to do is go to the size Y and just bring it down, squeeze these down. 0.54. And then I need to offset these. So I'm going to go down to the position and go to the global offset X and Y. And I'm just going to drag this to 0.5 for both the X and the Y. And this evenly offsets this tile sampler from this tile sampler. So let's just drag this and move these over. And we're going to keep these handy for later, but let's take a look back at our reference so we can start making some vertical support columns. So in addition to these horizontal bands, we also have these vertical columns which weaves between them. So we're going to apply some similar techniques to what we've done so far to create those. So I'm going to click on my graph and bring in a gradient linear 2, just like we did before. We're choosing the gradient linear 2 because it has that smooth fall off. And we need to make a pipe-like shape. Next up, I'm going to bring in a levels node. Now, another way of refining this tube shape in Substance Designer is using a levels node. And now this comes down to personal preference, but I want to show you both ways in case one clicks more with you. So what you can do, if we double click this levels and look in our 2D view, if we bring this top middle triangle here, which is also called the level in mid, we move this to the left and we're just tightening up those edges just like we did before. Now, if you'd like to dial in any of these parameters, you can click this top right button here. And this changes these values specifically. So we changed the level in mid. If you want to get the same parameter value as me, you can type in 0.44 here. And that's just going to move this top triangle here to the left a little bit. Now, next up, we're going to use a couple transformation 2D nodes to create and place these columns where we want them manually in our material. I'm going to click on my levels, hit spacebar, and bring in a transformation 2D. Now, one thing I'm noticing here is that our gradient linear is still moving from left to right like a pipe instead of up and down. So I can click on my gradient linear, go to the rotation parameter, and choose 90 degrees. And now if I go to my transform 2D and I click and drag this box here, we can squeeze this in to create some pipes. Now, I only want to create one pipe here, so what I'm going to do is go to the tiling mode in my transformation 2D, click this little box here and choose absolute. And instead of having it tile both horizontally and vertically, I just want it to tile vertically. This means that no matter where I move this, up or down, wherever this bounding box goes, it's still going to tile and it's not going to give me any seams. So if I hit spacebar, you can see it's just tiling vertically, which is great. Now, this is great. We can manually move these, but we're kind of doing it blind as we have no idea where we're moving these columns in proportion to where our bands are. So let's set a couple things up so that we can see what we're doing. First of all, after this transformation 2D, I'm going to bring in a mirror grayscale. So spacebar, mirror grayscale. So now everything that I do, if I double click this mirror grayscale and single click the transform 2D, everything I do on the left side is going to apply to the right side of our texture, which makes things easier. Now what we need to do is blend these columns here with our tile sampler. And instead of doing a normal blend, we're going to use a special node called height blend. So I'm going to select the connection here between our first tile sampler, the one with two columns with the larger bands. Select the connection between that and our final blend. Hit spacebar and bring in a height blend node. And so this automatically puts this tile sampler into the height bottom input of our height blend. Now I'm going to drag the output of our mirror grayscale and put that into the height top of the height blend. So this makes it really easy to determine which of these two layers, the height top or bottom, are above or beneath one another. And you can determine this with this height offset parameter. So if I bring this down, the height offset only affects the height top in terms of how high or low it is, above or below. So if I bring it all the way up here, it's going to go on top of the layer beneath. So let's choose something like, let's go with 0.23. Now I can already tell that these columns are way too big. We can fix that up in a second. I also want to make sure that the contrast parameter here is set to 1. You can see we have these nice, clean connection points. So now that we can see what we're doing, let's go to this transformation 2D from this column that we've made. I'm just going to single click it. So what I can do here is I can control click on this handle, and that allows me to adjust both the left and right sides and horizontally squish this in so we can make it much more of a smaller tube. Then what I want to do is move the column so that it's right on top of that pointed part of our band here, right where it's the highest peak of the height. And you can see that better here in our 3D view. So now it's looking like this column is what's pushing these bands outwards. Let's create a couple more columns. So I'm going to branch off another connection from our levels and create a new transformation 2D. Now this column is a little bit more tricky, but the mirror grayscale node helps us a lot to make it look like it tiles perfectly. So after the transformation 2D, spacebar and do another mirror grayscale. And so what I want to do is go back to that transform 2D and just make sure we adjust that tiling mode again. So I'm going to set it to absolute, and then we just want vertical tiling. So I'm going to double click the mirror grayscale and single click the transformation 2D. And so I'm just going to bring this in again so that we have a nice thin column. Now, if I hit spacebar, we can see that tiling again, and let's just move the column over. So now it looks like we have one singular column. So we just match those up perfectly. And I need to make a small adjustment here, just move it in. And now there's just one more column that we need to make. So branch another connection out of the levels, transformation 2D, change the tiling from absolute to vertical. And now I'm going to control click on this handle again and just squish it so it's right down in the center. And I'm trying to make all of these columns exactly the same size. They don't have to be perfect, but just make sure that they're relatively the same size. So what I can do is with these two columns here, let's blend them together. So spacebar, blend, and it doesn't matter where you put either of them. I'll just put the mirror grayscale in the foreground and this transform 2D of the middle column in the background, and then change the blending mode to add. So they're all together. If I hit spacebar, I can see them tiling, looking nice. Now let's blend these on with our other columns. And now I'm going to select the connection between our height blend and our final blend, and spacebar height blend, just like before. It puts the previous height blend into the height bottom by default. So let's take this blend here where we've added these two columns together and bring it into the height top of our height blend. So now you see it comes in full swing. Let's adjust some of our parameters here. So double click the height blend. I'm going to take the height offset down quite a bit here. 0.26. So now we have some columns that are underneath and some columns that are on top. So to keep things organized, I'm just going to make some frames here. So I'm just going to select all of our band nodes here, just the two tile samplers and those gradients. Frame them up, spacebar, frame. I'm just going to call this horizontal bands. And then I'm going to frame up our columns. Spacebar, frame, columns. I'll call them vertical column supports. Now, let's blend both of our horizontal bands together, and this is where the magic happens. So, let's make some room. I'm just going to drag our final blend and our outputs over to the right. Select the connection between our height blend here, our second one, and the final blend, and bring in a third height blend. Now, we didn't forget about this guy. Here's that second tile sampler that we made. Let's drag that tile sampler into the height top. Boom. Now we have a weaving pattern here. It looks awesome. And so we can adjust the height offset here if you want. You can make the smaller horizontal bands further in or extrude out. Completely up to you. I think I'm going to keep them here for now, 0.53. And just make sure that that contrast here is all the way at 1. And now we're off to a great start with our height. Next up, we need to be able to isolate our components that we've made here with some masks. Now, this is going to give us the ability to apply particular details onto a specific piece of our material, such as wood grain and wear and tear, if we want to target exactly where we want those details to go. So let's make some room again. I'm just going to drag our final blend and outputs to the right. And I'm going to click on my graph, hit spacebar, and just bring in a blend. So this is going to be our large bands mask. These are the big ones, the large ones. So I'm going to set our blend that we just made to subtract. And in the foreground, I'm going to take a mask that's already been made by our handy height blend node. So the height blend node makes what's called a height mask where the height top and the height bottom intersect. So in our second height blend here, we've got this height mask. I'm going to take this height mask and put it into the foreground. That's the second height blend. The output is that height mask here. This is what we're going to be subtracting. And we're going to be subtracting from the height mask in our first height blend. So let me draw off a connection from the height mask from our first height blend and let go. Don't connect it just yet because first we need to invert it. So if I double click this height mask here from our first height blend, you can see that the big bands are currently black and the small ones are white. But if we invert it, we now have the big bands in white. So if I connect that to the background of this blend that we have, now we're subtracting these columns from the big bands to get this. So I'm going to select this blend and frame it up here, spacebar frame, and change the color to something like purple. And I'm going to change the title to Large Bands Mask. Now let's do the small bands mask. And the small bands mask is a lot easier. It's just the height mask from our last of our 3 height blends, just this one here. I'm just gonna make a new blend here and then drag a connection from the height mask from that third height blend into the foreground. There we go. And so now I'm going to select this new blend, frame this up, make it purple, and call this small bands mask. So we've got our large bands, small bands. So now let's combine these two masks in case we want to isolate the small and big bands from the columns and vice versa. So I'll make a new blend and I'm just gonna connect the large bands mask to the foreground and the small bands mask to the background, and then just change the blending mode to add. Frame this up, purple, combined mask. Great. Now let's add some detail to these weaving bands. Let's start by adding some wood grain. So first off, I'm going to click on my graph, hit spacebar, and bring in a directional noise. I'm going to use directional noise 1. And the reason why I chose this particular noise is because it has this nice directional horizontal flow here, but also some nice diversity and some good noise patterns here. And it just looks good with what we're going for. But I want to change it just a tiny bit to make it conform to our bands a bit better. Now, try not to count how many times I say band in this tutorial. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my large bands mask. I'm going to branch off a connection. I'm going to let go, and I'm going to choose to bring in a non-uniform blur grayscale. In fact, I'm going to connect this to both of the inputs of this non-uniform blur grayscale. And what this does is it adds some dimension to this flat shape that we have from this mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to these samples here in the non-uniform blur grayscale and just bring them all the way to the right to 16, and the same with blades all the way to 9. And then I can adjust this intensity. And this is a really good way to add some three-dimensionality to a flat shape, like I mentioned before. But it's also a good way to create some sort of warping intensity, which we'll tackle in just a second. So I'm going to keep the intensity around 4. And what I'm going to do is bring in a warp node. Let's just rearrange this a little bit. I'm going to warp this directional 1 noise by this non-uniform blur grayscale by putting that into the gradient input. Now you can see what's going on here. If I double click the warp, but then change this intensity, you can see how the directional noise is starting to conform to our large bands. So I'm going to keep the intensity pretty low, 0.03. And so now let's multiply this noise onto our current height stack here. So I'm just going to select the connection that's connected to our final blend and also connected to our last height blend. Spacebar, bring in another blend. Let's move that over here. And let's put the warp into the foreground and then change the blending mode to multiply. Excellent. So now a couple things need to do this blend. First of all, we need to decide where we want this noise to appear, which is why we created some masks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get our large bands mask and drag it into the opacity input of that blend. So now the noise is just appearing where I want it to go. And now let's bring down that opacity of that blend quite a bit. We're really only looking for some subtle detail here, 0.05. So now I've got some nice wood grain appearing on the large bands. Now let's do the same thing to our small bands. So I'm going to make some more room, select this connection, bring in a blend, and I'm going to bring that same warp into the foreground, and then for the opacity mask, I'm going to drag in the small bands. And then like before, this blending mode needs to be multiply, and let's just change the opacity and bring it down. I'm going to bring it down even more than before. How about 0.03? Great. And if I hit Control Shift and right click, I can move the light around to see that detail. Great. So I'm going to select these nodes, the non-uniform blur, the warp, and the directional noise, spacebar, frame, and call this wood grain. Now let's add some more tactile detail. So for this extra amount of detail, I'm going to bring in a grunge map. So grunge, G-R-U-N-G-E, map, let's do 001. And I like this one because it has some vertical detail, which is going to contrast with the horizontal detail of our grain. Now I'm going to go to the contrast and just bring this all the way to the left so that we get the full range of grayscale values here from this map. Then I'm going to bring in another blend node. So one way that I like to work is I like to have this horizontal, what I call a blend line, so that it kind of works like layers in Photoshop, and that you can, from left to right, see how these components are being added on or how it changes the height map over time. So I'm going to select this connection again, spacebar blend, and I'm also going to set this blending mode to multiply, and we're just going to multiply on this grunge map. Now it's way too intense, so double clicking this blend, let's bring the opacity down. Again, a really small value, 0.04. Let's zoom in here, and there we go. We have this nice intricate little detail here. And I like to add that contrasting vertical detail so that it offsets things and adds a bit more of that tactile feel, like you can really touch this. So let's just select that grunge map, frame it up, and I'm going to call this Tactile Detail. And it's nice to name all these just so you can really see what's going on as you work. So we're going to continue to make some space, and now I want to add some chipping. So I'll bring in a black and white spots 1. So that's B and W spots 1. Now this noise has a bunch of small patches of random spots. And I like that, but what I don't like is how it has these dark patches or these large variances in grayscale values. And I just want to filter them out so that I have the really high frequency detail. So to do that, we can use a high pass grayscale filter. So if I click on the black and white spots 1 spacebar, high pass grayscale, now all of those large dark patches have disappeared. So before and after, and I can change the radius of this filter so that I can bring in more or less. of those larger patches. So 8.88 looks pretty good because I don't want to get rid of it completely, but really want to focus in on that high frequency detail. After the high pass grayscale, let's bring in a histogram scan. And if I bring up the position slightly, we can see some of those specks come into view here. Let's zoom in and we can see we've got small patches like this. Let's bring it in a little more. Yeah, 0.13. And now let's bring a slope blur grayscale. So spacebar slope blur grayscale. And so how are we going to slope this histogram scan? And that's going to be with a clouds 2 noise. So I'm going to bring in a clouds 2 and connect this clouds 2 to the slope input of our slope blur grayscale. So if I double click here, we're not going to see very much. But if I bring the samples all the way up to 32 and then decrease the intensity, you can start to see what the slope blur is doing. So I have the intensity really small, like 0.17. And the slope blur is thickening up these small dots into sharper, more coherent marks. So if I switch between the histogram scan and the slope blur, you can see they're much sharper, more thicker, larger pieces. More like these chips that I'm going for. So now I want to subtract these chips from our height. So I'm going to add another blend to our blend line. So that's the connection between the previous blend and our final blend. And I'm going to set the blend mode to subtract. And we're going to bring our slope blur grayscale into the foreground. And let's take the opacity down. Again, another small number, a lot of small details with this material. And now I've got some really nice chipping effects. We've got these neat little organic holes. It's really starting to sell what this material is made out of. So I'm going to select our nodes, frame them up, call this chipping. Don't forget to save. So to overview what we've done so far, we've created the base shapes here. We've got our horizontal bands and our vertical columns. We've blended them together with height blends. We've created a couple masks that are going to help us target where we put all of this detail. And now we've started to add some detail. So we did some wood grain. We've added some vertical tactile detail to offset and contrast the horizontal wood grain. And we've added some neat chipping. Let's create our own cracks generator. What we need to do is create a bunch of small random dots of different grayscale values and scatter them about. We can then use the distance node to expand these small dots into a Voronoi pattern and use those shapes to create our cracks. So we're going to start off our cracks with a node called splatter circular. So spacebar, splatter circular. Now splatter circular is a fantastic node. It's kind of like a tile sampler or a tile generator, but specifically geared towards circular pattern distribution. And because it's cheap on performance, it's an easy way to just scatter some dots around. So I'm going to go to the pattern settings here and choose disk, because we just need this to be a flat shape, no blurred edges or anything like that, no gradients. And I'm going to bring up the pattern amount. In fact, I'm going to bring it up so much, let's just pick a large number, like, 134. And then let's go down to the position and just increase this radius. Now, this is a pretty cool effect, but I'm going to bring it up, sure, something like 0.83. And now if we go to the radius random, we can bring this up and just push all of these circles into a random position here. So yeah, something like 0.9, that's fine. The aim of the game here is to make sure that most of these circles don't touch one another or overlap. So I'm going to go to scale here and just drag this down. And then now to distinguish each of these dots from one another, I'm going to go down to the color parameters and just bring the luminance random all the way up to 1. So now all of these dots have a different grayscale value. Next up, after the splatter circular, let's add a distance node. And we're going to connect the splatter circular to both inputs on the distance node, the mask input and the source input. And we're going to change this to only source. So let's just type in a really large number into the maximum distance here. Let's go with like 10,000. And now you can see that our dots have expanded into these Voronoi shapes. And now to isolate these lines, we're going to use an edge detect. So spacebar, edge detect. And let's bring the roundness down to 0. And let's bring the edge width down really small, something like 1.13. And now what I want to do is add a little bit of grayscale blur between these two white shapes, just so we have some information to play with, and that'll make sense in a second. So after the edge detect, let's add a bevel node. Let's bring the distance down. Now we can start to see that we're getting a little bit of that grayscale information in between. So 0.01 on the distance of our bevel. And then after the bevel, let's add a slope blur. Slope blur grayscale. And so what are we going to use to drive the slope? We're going to use the same node that we used before, and that's this clouds 2. So I'm just going to borrow another connection from the clouds 2 and attach it to the slope input of this new slope blur. And so let's double click the slope blur, bring the samples all the way up to 32 again. And this time I'm going to change the mode from blur to min. And so if I bring down this intensity, zoom out a little bit, min just pushes those dark values into the light values. So I'm just going to choose an intensity. So let me show you what happens if we blended these cracks as they are right on top of our material. So again, I'm going to select this connection, blend. So we're just adding on to our blend line here. Let's bring that slope blur into the foreground, and I'm going to blend this by multiplying it. So right now, they look like they've been stamped onto our material. You can tell because some of these cracks are overlapping with pieces that are separated from one another. Now, to remedy this, we're going to use a directional warp node to push these cracks in a particular direction based on the different larger shapes of these bands. Now, we can generate a grayscale directional warp intensity map, wow, that was a lot of words, with a couple of amazing flood fill nodes. So overall, we're just going to push these cracks so that they no longer look like they're connected to one another. But to do that, we need to generate a map of grayscale values based on these shapes. It's really cool. Let me show you how to do that now. So to create this map, we're going to go all the way back to where we have our masks. So let's first combine our two small and large masks together. But this time, we need to combine them so that we can see a difference between the two of them. And so that makes sense in a second. We just need to separate the two shapes. So I'm going to bring in a blend here, just clicking in the graph, blend. And I'm going to take our small bands mask and put it into the foreground, and the large bands mask and put it into the background. And I'm going to change the blend mode to add, but this time I'm going to bring down the opacity so that we can see visually that our small bands are a different color than the big bands. Then after this blend, I'm going to add an edge detect. And now you can see that it's detected that there's separation between these shapes. Now I'm going to get rid of the roundness again, and I'm going to bring the edge width all the way down to 1. Now that we have these islands of shapes that are separated by these small black borders, we can use the flood fill node. So spacebar, flood fill, and you can see it's detected these shapes. The flood fill node understands that each of these islands separated by a solid black border are separate pieces. Now, we can use that information by attaching a new flood fill to random grayscale node to assign different random grayscale values to each of these pieces. So, after the flood fill, hit spacebar, type in flood fill again, and these are all the flood fill family nodes. Now we can choose flood fill to random grayscale, and so now each of these shapes have different grayscale values. Now we can use these random grayscale values to determine the intensity of how much our directional warp is going to offset or push these cracks that we've made, making them look like they aren't equally stamped on top of our material. So I'm just going to group these and frame them up. I'm going to call this directional warp intensity. And so now let me just bring our cracks generator that we have here up as well. And after the slope blur grayscale that we made with these really cool patterns, I'm going to hit spacebar and bring in our directional warp. So here's our directional warp. It needs our intensity input. So let's go back, get our flood filter random grayscale, and connect that into the directional warp intensity input. Double click on the directional warp, and now we'll leave the warp angle at default and just bring up the intensity. In fact, let's bring it up really high. Let's go like 100. And so now these cracks are no longer connecting with one another, and they look like they are separate pieces. And so creating this kind of a map is very common in Substance Designer, where you take some shapes and you offset them by different grayscale values by using a directional warp. And so now that we have these cracks, they're looking a bit intense. So I'm going to go to the blend, which is where we added on these cracks to our height, and just decrease the opacity quite a bit. Something very subtle like 0.06. So now you can see we've got these cracks, and they're happening all over our material. In fact, they're happening so much that I think I want to limit how many cracks we can see. So here's a really cool technique to sort of determine where you want these cracks to appear. So I'm going to reorganize just a little bit, move our outputs, and let's just select and frame these up, call this cracks. And so now let's take a look at this blend that we've made here, which multiplies the cracks onto our height line that we've made. I want to add a mask into this opacity slot. So I'm going to hit spacebar and bring in a purlin noise. Let's bring the scale down. 17 looks good. And then after the purlin noise, I'm going to bring in a levels. And I'm just going to tighten up the values a bit by bringing the top left and top right triangles together so I can get more of a contrast and have lots of bright values and lots of dark values and a little bit in between. And so now I can bring this output into the opacity. And so now we've got a couple cracks, but they're very organically placed. So let's take a look at our material, step back for a minute, and see what we've done. Now, right now, our material is very geometrically straight. Now, this is okay if the model that you're applying this material to has a lot of organic shaping or sculpting applied to it, but if it doesn't, we can add a little bit of organic warping to it just to give it more of a realistic feel. So we're going to use another directional warp. And this time, we're going to warp the entire height line that we have so far. So after our latest blend here, before our final blend, we're going to spacebar and bring in a directional warp. And so I want to warp this with another purlin noise. So I'll just drag out from the intensity input and type in purlin noise. And we want a very large scale, or I guess a small scale value, but large detail. So I'm going to choose 3 as the scale. And now if I go into the directional warp here, and let's adjust some of these parameters. So maybe I'll bring up the intensity to 20. And then let's play with this warp angle. So we can shift this around here a little bit. Yeah, so minus 26 degrees, kind of southwest in this way. It's adding a nice organic, natural look to our pattern. So let's just frame this up. And I'll call this organic warping. And now we have most of our height information created for our woven basket material. Now, I say most because there's a really cool detail that we're going to add pretty soon, and that will make more sense later on. So, as another quick overview, we started with our basic shapes that we blended together, created some masks, and then we started adding some smaller details like wood grain, some contrasting vertical detail, some chipping, and then we created our own cracks generator, which we then used a directional warp intensity map that we created from our flood fill nodes, blended them on with a simple organic mask here, and then did some pushing and warping to make it seem like this material is more organic and lifelike. Now it's time to move on to the roughness and color information. For this material, we're going to apply a simple roughness technique that takes the detail that we've already made and applies a realistic amount of reflection based on curvature. So, in other words, the parts of the texture that have the crevices and cracks are going to be rough, and the bumpy, protruding detail will be shinier. Now, this technique enhances our detail and makes it pop a little more. So I'm going to take the outputs that we have over here, not the final blend, just drag these over so we get some room. And then let's zoom into our roughness here. And I'm going to remove the uniform color that came with our template that's connected to the roughness output. So delete that. Now what I want to do is I want to create a curvature smooth node. So I'm clicking my graph, space curvature smooth. And the curvature smooth node requires a normal, like one of these, as our input. So I'm going to make a new one. So normal, and connect that to the curvature smooth. And so let's grab a connection from our final blend here where everything is connected and bring that into the normal. And so if I double click the curvature smooth, you're not going to see that much detail. So let's go back to this normal node, the new one that we just made, and let's bring up the intensity. Let's bring it up a lot. Let's bring it to something like 10. And yeah, that might be too much. That's all right. 9.67. It's fine. Just a bunch more detail. And then go to your curvature smooth. You can see we have a lot more going on here. However, we know that white means that it's rougher and black means that it's shinier. So it's currently the opposite of what we want it to be. So after our curvature smooth, spacebar, invert grayscale. And now this is what we're looking for. The dark patches, the crevices, are going to be a lot more rough. And the darker patches, where they're more black, are going to be shinier. Let's connect that to our roughness to see what we're doing. And now, if I Control-Shift right-click in our 3D view and drag, we're getting a much more realistic roughness. However, let's adjust it just a little bit more. We can use a levels node to keep the roughness detail that we've made, but intensify or decrease it to the necessary degree that we want for this material. So this allows you to decide if you'd like the material to be wet or dry without removing the detail that we just created with the normal and the curvature nodes. So I'm going to select the curvature and the invert grayscale and just move them over. Let's just move everything over. And after the invert grayscale, I'm just going to bring in a levels. There we go. And so I can take this bottom left triangle and I can just move this in. And if you see in the 2D view, it's just brightening everything up, but it's not removing any of that detail. It's brightening the darkest values that we have and clipping it so that it can't get any darker than what we have set here. So now if we move our light around, that looks better. We still have some shiny highlights here, but they're not too shiny in that we're just making these extra details pop. For the color of this material, we're going to use a couple of techniques, such as gradient maps and some simple blending of values to get our result. So let's make our first gradient map, and that's just the base color, sort of the overall general shade that this material is going to be. So I'm going to click on our graph and hit spacebar and add a gradient map. It's the first one at the top there. And I'm going to connect our directional warp, it's just the last node in the long chain of our height, and connect that into the input. So to quickly get some color information, we're using a gradient map. I'm going to open up the gradient editor. And we're going to pick some keys from an image using this pick gradient option. So I've got my reference here. This is using an app called Pure Ref. And what's nice about Pure Ref is I can hit Control-Shift-A. And this enables this always on top feature. So I can go over here and click and do whatever I want, and this still appears on my screen. So I can pick the gradient, just go over across, click and drag, pick some of these keys. And the really important thing here is to take this precision slider and drag it all the way to the left. And I'll show you why. If I connect the gradient map to this base color and delete the uniform color that came with the template, if I pick a gradient again, and we have a bunch of keys here, you're going to notice it's going to give you these really cool, but really unwanted at this point, banding because of how we set up our height information. So if we decrease the precision, we're going to be left with a much simpler amount. Now, this is a bad example. Let me go and pick another gradient here. And now you can see we've got a nice smooth result here. Now I'm just going to pick a couple keys and see if I can get a result that I want. So here are some keys that I've picked. You see I only have 3 here, and they're pretty light. And that's because we're going to add some darker values later on. But we've got a nice soft gradient here happening. And so now I've got a nice smooth base of our color here. Now let's add some variation based on the tactile detail noise that we used earlier. But here's the thing. We can't just reference this noise directly because we directionally warped our entire height map afterward. So to make them match up, we have to duplicate our directional warp nodes. Now, I like to do this by creating this visual wall of directional warps, which you'll see in a few minutes. So I'm going to take this directional warp. Now, this is the directional warp at the end of our height with that large purlin noise that we did. So I'm just going to duplicate just the directional warp. And then for the input, I'm going to go back and find that tactile detail noise. So I'm going to click and drag, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some dot nodes to keep things organized. So I still have this, I'm still clicking and dragging, and I'm using the middle mouse button to pan and zoom. Now if I press the Alt key, it's going to drop a pin right there. And now if I continue holding and clicking and dragging, I can just move this over into the top one here, the input of our directional warp. And so I can go back and I can just organize this and make this clean. And I know I might have some slight OCD when it comes to this kind of graph, but it really helps organization in the long run. So we've directionally warped our noise, so it's going to match everything on our height. Now let's do another gradient map to colorize this information. So I'm going to drag a connection off of this new directional warp, bring it up here next to our other gradient map, let go, and add a new gradient map. Here we are. Let's make some room as well. I'm just going to bring everything over a little bit. And so now I'm going to go to my gradient editor and pick some more keys for my reference. Now, this time, I'm going to try and include some slightly darker values. Not too dark. But I'm just going to go in, pick a gradient, drag across, and yeah, starting to get something like this. You can also invert the positions, see what that does. But if you invert the positions, you're going to lose this precision slider. It needs to happen right after you pick the gradient. So now I can adjust this precision. I can make it simpler or more keys. I don't want too many keys. Let's try another one. That looks good. Couple semi-dark patches, a little bit of light, and some of that midtones. Great. So let's blend these two together. So I'm going to select this connection. This is the gradient map that we had from before, connected to our base color. Bring in a blend. Let's connect our new gradient map to the foreground. I'm going to keep the blending mode set to copy, but what I can do is just bring down this opacity a little bit. 0.77. Yeah, now we're starting to get some nice variance here. Some cool organic patterns that match up with the height information. Now let's do the same thing, but for the wood grain. So I'm going to go back, and here's our directional warps that we have. We're just going to duplicate another one of those, bring it down here, and you can see what I mean by this wall of directional warps. We're just going to stack them up vertically like this so that you read the graph from left to right, and you can tell all of these nodes are now being warped the same way that they are being warped as the height. In fact, what I can do is I can adjust this frame to really make that stand out so that I can just have it include all these warp nodes that we're going to make, and I'll make it a different color like red so we can really see what's happening here in the graph. So we've got this new duplicate of the directional warp. Let's find our wood grain. Here it is. Let's take that warp, drag it out. I'm going to make another dot node by pressing Alt and then letting go, but still clicking and dragging. And just bring that into the input again of the directional warp. And I can clean this up. Just move this down. Everything's nice and flat. Great. And then let's create another gradient map. So I'll take a connection off of our new directional warp from our wood grain. And just bring it up here somewhere. Gradient map. Just like before. Let's pick some keys. This time it's going to be the highest precision, and we're going to include some more dark values. So pick gradient. Make sure we get some of this dark stuff and the light. Let's bring up the precision. And we'll just pick some more. Maybe invert the positions. Yeah, that's looking good. Okay, so let's blend this on. We'll select that connection for our color. Blend, and then connect the gradient map to the foreground. Keep the blend mode set to copy. And let's just bring down the opacity. Great. Now we're running into one small problem, and that is that the wood grain color is now overlapping onto our columns here. So all that means we need to do is just supply a mask in our opacity of our blend here, connected to our gradient maps. So we do have to remember that we are warping everything after we've made these masks. So let's duplicate another copy of our directional warp. And then let's go back, and I need the combined mask because we just want this to appear on our horizontal banding. I'll drag this into the input. And then another way to add a dot node is if you hover over a connection and hold Alt, you see you get this pin. So click while you're holding Alt, and then you can drag it where you need it to go. Great. And now let's take this directional warp, plug it into the opacity of this new blend we've made. And so now it's no longer on the columns, but it's here on the bands. Now you can do the same thing, and you can target the columns if you wanted to, and just add another gradient map and add some detail in, and then just invert this combined mask to just target the columns. If your goal is to create a shiny new woven basket, congratulations, you've done it. But now let's add one more detail. Let's add some realistic wear and tear, where the bands have rubbed against the columns. Let's do that now. If we take another look at our reference, notice that we have these white marks where these bands have rubbed together and they've rubbed with the columns to show that this material has been used, it's been worn, and it's old, it's not brand new. So to apply this effect procedurally, we can use a handy node called the shadows node. So let's keep organized. I'm just going to select all this color information up here, frame it up, and I'm just going to call it base albedo. And I like to make my color information frames green. It just kind of separates it visually for me. So I've added a couple of dot nodes just to keep things flat and organized. Let's create that shadows node. So up here in the graph, not connected to anything, I'm going to hit spacebar and type in shadows. And then I'm going to connect the directional warp at the top here, the one that has all of our main height information, and connect that into the input of our shadows. You can see what it does here. The shadows node simulates shining a light from this particular direction, casting shadows from our height map. This is an easy way to isolate crevices like these. So I'm going to bring up the samples all the way to 16, and let's adjust the softness a little bit. And I'm going to increase the shadow distance. And now we can play with this light angle, see what we want to get here. And so now we have this shadow information, but to isolate those crevices, I'm going to invert this. So click on shadows, spacebar, invert grayscale. You can see we're kind of isolating these shadows now, and everything else is dark. After the invert grayscale, let's bring in a slope blur. And I'm going to grab that same clouds noise. We're just going to keep reusing that one over and over again. So we're back in chipping land. Drag another connection from that clouds 2. I'm going to create another dot node by pressing Alt and just bring that into the slope here. Crank up the samples to 32. Change the mode to min. And bring down the intensity. 0.72 looks good. This is what we're getting. Now this is a way to distort and emphasize these patches. Next up, after the slope blur grayscale, I'm going to add a histogram scan, and let's bring up the position. 0.78, and then let's crank up this contrast. And this focuses and sharpens these edges. Now, I want to distort these shapes just a little bit more, make them look like cracks and chips. So let's warp these with a directional warp. So after the histogram scan, click directional warp. And I'm going to warp this with a crystal 1 noise. I'm going to keep it default at 32 in terms of scale. Connect that crystal 1 into the intensity input. You can double click the warp and see what we're doing here. And so now you can see we're just adding in some sharp peaks and valleys into that. I can change the warp angle if I'd like. Sure, that looks good. Minus 17 degrees. We're getting these nice sharp shapes here. And it looks like the wood has chipped or broken off by small pieces. Now, like before with our cracks, I don't want these patches to be stamped across everything exactly the same across the whole material. So I'm going to blend a grunge map over them to create some more diversity. So I'm going to move some things over a little bit. And I'm going to bring in a grunge map 001, the same one that we used before. And I'm going to bring in a blend. So I'll take that directional warp and put it into the foreground and this grunge map 01 and just put it into the opacity. And now we're getting some diverse grayscale information in here, breaking this up a bit. And now with that grunge map that we just added, I'm going to go to the balance slider and just bring this down a little bit. Maybe to something like 23. And this gives us some more dark values to play with, and that really breaks up what's going on with our blend here. Now, let's frame this up. I'm going to call this where. And I'll make it green, even though right now what we're going to do is we're going to affect not just the color information, but also the height information. So it looks like it's really being chipped in there and a little more realistic. So I'm going to go back to our height blend line. This is down here, connected to our final blend. Select that connection. Add another blend in. It puts it in the middle over here. And let's connect this new blend that we have here from our grunge map and directional warp from the where that we just made. And let's just add a dot node, bring it in to the foreground, and I'm going to set this to subtract. Let's bring down the opacity, 0.04, and now we've got some nice chipping wear and tear here. But there's no color information yet, so let's add that. So with the connection that's connected to our base color, let's add another blend. And what's nice about these dot nodes is you can also branch connections off of those. So I could just take a connection off of there and put that into the foreground. But wait, this is still grayscale information. So we need to select this and add a gradient map node, which easily converts grayscale information to color information. And so if I just keep this over here and hit the D key, this just docks it in here. It's a quick way to remind me that nothing's happening with this gradient map node. It's just converting things from grayscale to color information. Now back to this blend for our color information. I'm going to change this blend mode from copy to add and just bring down the opacity so we can get some of that original color shining through. Something like 0.52. Yeah, 0.52. Now, this is great, but it looks a bit harsh. There's some chipping here, but there's no other wear. It looks like it's just appearing from nothing. So let's soften this new chipping edgeware detail with a little bit of extra softer powdery edgeware around it, just to kind of blend it in with everything. So I'm going to go back up here and branch off a third connection. This is just from that blend from our wear frame up here. Just a branch off a connection, and I'm going to bring in a blur high quality grayscale. And it doesn't need to be too intense. Let's just bring this down to something around 6.06. And then I'm going to take a dirt noise. So spacebar dirt, I'll use dirt 4. Now I like this noise because it's scratchy and powdery and it'll be nice to blend on our blur here. So I'll get a blend. We're going to multiply these two together. So I'll just take this blur, put it in the background, the dirt in the foreground, and multiply them together. There we go. And it's looking a bit dark, so I'm going to brighten it up with the levels. So I'll select this blend, levels, and drag this top right triangle to the left here. Now let's blend this onto our color. So I'll select that connection again before our base color output. Blend. Gonna choose add, and then take that levels and put it into the foreground. And like before, let's select that connection, spacebar, add a gradient map, and then I'll hit D to dock it in. You can see we've got some nice powdery wear around where that edge wear is happening. So let's frame this up. Call this surrounding wear. Make that green. Hit F now to frame everything up. You can see this is our crazy graph that we've created. And we all started with some simple shapes that we tiled together, created some masks, started adding some extra details in. We warped everything, and then we started adding our color information, where we started from a simple gradient map, then we started adding some extra darker details, finally the darkest with the wood grain, and we created some extra wear and tear here. We made this really cool rubbing chipped edges and surrounding edge wear to blend everything in, till we get this woven basket material. It's pretty amazing what you can do with just a few nodes, like the tile sampler, distance, directional warp, and even some purlin noises and some gradient linear nodes. It's important to start with the larger shapes and then work your way in to the smaller details. In this tutorial, we started off with our base band shapes and then created all of the masks that we needed so that we can later on target where we wanted to put that extra detail. We then created a cool cracks generator with a distance node to create some Voronoi patterns. It's really handy, and you can apply it to a bunch of other materials as well. I also find it really helpful to frame up your components to keep your graph organized so that when you finish your first pass at creating a material, you don't get lost and confused later on when a client wants to tweak a particular important detail. Also, don't forget to change the random seed by double-clicking in your graph and changing the slider. Because it's procedurally made, you can create an unlimited amount of variations in just a snap. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up. It lets me know that you're watching and that you'd like to see more Substance Designer tutorials like these. And if you would like to see more videos from me, hit subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos. Now, I've got quite a few awesome tutorials coming up, including a new texture tutorial series for Substance Designer coming out very soon. I'm really excited about it. I'm Jeremy Signer. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.